Hey everyone, this is my summary of the book Salt, Sugar, Fat. This was a long book, clocking in at a little over 14 and a half hours via audiobook. There was a lot of information in there. This is a fairly short summary. The book talked a ton about why there is so much salt, so much sugar, and so much fat in our diet today. And it's really a focus on processed foods. It's all about food manufacturers. They talk a lot about some older manufacturers like General Foods, more modern ones like Kraft. There's a lot of stuff that happens in Minnesota in this book. Minnesota is huge on food. We got a lot of big companies. They talk a lot about Cargill, a lot about salt, about all the different types of salt that Cargill produces. It was a fascinating book. I really enjoyed just listening to all the background behind all of this. But let me get into some of my notes here. Food companies promote the food pyramid. You know, they say this is how you're supposed to eat, this is what's right. But then if you look at their advertising dollars, what they really want us to eat, it's completely upside down. They spend the very most amount of money on all the stuff we just shouldn't be eating at all. It has no place in our diet. It's stuff that should be used sparingly for special occasions and preferably not at all. And that's where most of their advertising budget is spent. So they're liars. They don't want us to eat healthy. The book talks a lot about big tobacco companies and lawsuits that states filed against tobacco companies. How they, if I remember the numbers right, there was a lawsuit where the tobacco companies had to pay out. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of $365 billion to states to help pay for healthcare costs. I mean, crazy. And they won these suits against tobacco companies because they were able to prove that the tobacco companies knew that their product was bad for people, and they wouldn't clearly tell people about this. And the states have these huge medical costs that they're incurring, and they said, Big Tobacco, you are responsible for this. You had an obligation to not sell something that's going to kill people. And, you know, there's arguments over free speech and choice and, you know, big government and how much role should the government play. But it was found that tobacco companies were liable for this. And so then the author starts talking about big food companies. We have huge food corporations who are essentially doing the same thing. They're selling food that kills us. And where's the responsibility there? So I'm not going to answer that question, but that's kind of what the book is based on a little bit. There is a ridiculous amount of money to be made in the food industry. It is crazy. It's like they're printing money, making all these processed foods. And the way to do this is to find the exact right formula for a food that people will like and buy. And the way to do that is the exact right blend of salt, sugar, and fat. Nutrition is a complete afterthought for all of the largest food manufacturers. Now, you know what? This book was written in 2014, so maybe things have changed in the last 7 years. I don't know. And don't take this as me saying it. This is what the author says. But the author essentially says that food manufacturers, if they could double the amount of nutrition in a food, but it's going to cost them 0.01% profits, it's off the table. Whatever they do, it cannot touch profits. It doesn't matter how much better it makes their food. Profits is all that matters to big food companies. They have zero interest in bringing nutrition to people unless it's going to bring them more profits. That's all it comes down to. One of the largest food manufacturers, this was news to me, one of the largest food manufacturers, General Foods, was purchased by Philip Morris, the tobacco company, the Marlboro. It was purchased by Philip Morris for $5.75 billion in 1985. You see, Philip Morris was really good at selling the public something that is not good for them. And now I'm making up my own part here, but they were really good at selling the public something that was not good for them. And so they said, why don't we move into the food business? And we'll acquire the largest food manufacturer at the time, and we'll put a good spin on selling the public stuff that we know is not good for them. Now, since, if I got my numbers right, and Kraft was also acquired by the Philip Morris Company. Since I know that Kraft has become completely independent, I don't think they're any longer owned by Philip Morris. And I don't remember if the author talked on General Foods, but thought that was just fascinating. There's a story about how General Foods never wanted to add any type of chemicals to their food. I mean, they were staunchly opposed. They didn't want all this extra stuff added in their processed foods because they wanted their food more pure, and they were afraid of the public's perception. It wasn't about health. It was that the public would not accept these chemicals that they don't recognize being added to foods. And they were trying so hard to get an instant pudding. And they had somebody who spent years and years trying to develop this, and all of a sudden one day they just made an about face, and they told the scientists to use whatever means necessary to make instant pudding, and they got it done like that as soon as they could add whatever chemicals they wanted. And that happened in the 50s, and it changed the landscape of processed foods forever. And all of a sudden the floodgates opened, and the public started to be more accepting of all these chemicals being added to their food that they didn't understand. So that made a lot of changes to our food. Talked a lot about Coke and soft drinks. Talked about this guy named Michael Dunn, who was basically second in command at Coke. He was at Coca-Cola. He was next in line to become the president of Coke, but he basically came to the realization that Coke was making the world worse. When they started going into third world countries to offer their product, and he actually visited a third world country, and he saw the squalor that these people were living in, knowing that they didn't have the money for Coke, but also knowing that as soon as they come into this market, they're going to kill it. They're going to sell tons and tons and tons of Coke, and it's not good for people. I think we know this. And these people don't have the money to afford it, yet they will take the little money they have and they'll buy products like Coke. And he came to the realization that what they're doing is a bad thing. They're making the world worse. And he said that if you were to graph he has graphed the obesity epidemic, and it falls in lockstep with Coca-Cola, well, I shouldn't say Coca-Cola, with soft drink consumption. Drinking calories. Drinking calories is way worse than eating calories. Your body doesn't get satiated when you drink your calories. So it's especially bad to drink your calories. And basically, Michael Dunn, he started making changes, like they ended their marketing to public schools, and he did a whole bunch of stuff, and basically he got let go. That was the end of his time with Coke, as soon as he started developing a conscience about this. In the Coke versus Pepsi war, they talked a lot about that. They said that there was no losers. Sales of both of those continually increased all throughout the Coke versus Pepsi wars that happened, and they made each other better. Roger Enrico, the past CEO of Pepsi, he wrote in 1986 that if Coke didn't exist, they'd pray for someone to invent it. And I've heard this before, where you have competitors. Competitors are good for each other. They make each other better. So there were no losers in the Coke versus Pepsi war. Each company just continually increased sales and profits. And then a little bit about table salt. Table salt actually makes up a very small amount of our sodium intake. Most of our sodium intake actually comes from processed foods. It's not salt that we add to our food ourselves. It's salt that's already in the food. And humans are not naturally inclined to like the taste of salt. It's definitely an acquired taste. And when people remove salt from their diet, you stop consuming salt for a fairly short period of time. It can just be a couple of months. People will get to the point where they eat traditional processed foods and it's almost unpalatable. It is way too salty. They dislike the taste of it. And food manufacturers are being pushed to remove salt from their products, but it's really difficult for them to do this because salt adds so much to food, not only in flavor, but it also helps to preserve the food and it helps with the texture and the look of foods. It dramatically improves all of this stuff, and there's no way to do it for anywhere near the cost of what salt will do. So we are basically stuck with having a ton of salt in all of our processed foods. So the book, as you might imagine, spends a ton of time talking about sugar, about all the evils of sugar, and about how it's added to everything. Does the same thing with fat. There's so much saturated fat, and talks about how salt is bad for us too. And I guess if I was going to sum up the book, I'd say that just about all manufactured foods are bad for us. Not 100% of them, but most of them. You read the labels and it's just unbelievable how much sugar and salt are added to products. So it really reinforces my desire to not eat anything that comes in a package. That is my summary of all of this. So, very interesting book. I just gave you the highlights of it. So many fascinating stories in here. I was kind of sorry when the book ended. It was really interesting. Lots of good stories. Okay, thanks for listening. This has been Reuben's Corner.